Hi.
How are you?
Nice to see everybody.
Good to see
Good to
you.
be here.
So everyone, this is Amanda. She's the other half of Yabantu and behind the operations. And Chrissy as well. We're gonna give it a few more minutes so that I can introduce everybody and get this party started.
I just started recording so that people are notified when they log in. It should tell them that this will be recorded.
Fantastic.
So we should be good.
Great. Um, just 1 minute away from 7.
Hey Trey,
Yeah.
is it cool that I gave my sister the link for this?
Hey man, as many people as you'd like, for
All
sure.
right, right on. I just wanted to make sure that this wasn't going to be like closed off or by
No,
invite only or something like that.
nah, man, it's all good. The people,
Excellent.
I want that.
Thank you.
Anthony, what's happening? Hello, hello. You're muted.
Hi.
Thank you. Hi, everybody.
Hey, what's going on?
How's it
Lori,
going?
what's up? Good. How are you?
Good. Good to be here.
Just wanted to say hi. We're here.
Good. Good to see you. Good to see you.
You too. Hey, Chris.
Hey, what's up, Lori?
Not much. How's it going?
No, I'm good.
Hi, Amanda. Hi, everybody else.
All right. So, how prompt do we want to be? It is 7.
It's your party.
I'm the kind of guy, you know what I mean? I'll give you guys till like 7:02, you know? And, so yeah, when we start, I don't think we need to introduce everybody, but except for the major players, you know what I mean? Chris, Nick. And Nick, do you want me to go with Nick Bear?
Yeah, that's fine.
Cool.
Yeah.
And then we'll get this exciting conversation started. So Anthony, anything new? What's happening with you?
All kinds of fun stuff. I went and got another COVID test today, and I am asymptomatic and COVID-free, which is delightful.
Very good.
My brother-in-law is up visiting. We live about 7 blocks from my wife's parents, so he's up visiting. So I got to spend some time with him today, which is always a pleasure.
Very good.
And just enjoying life, making the
like
best
it.
out of it, you know?
Yeah.
I enjoyed your Facebook post from your Ubuntu the other day. I can't wait to talk to you about that. I have so many thoughts about it.
A lot of people say that, man.
No, it's great. It's great. You know what? I think it's lovely.
All right, good.
Like, you know,
Yeah, no, I'm here. I'm down for it, man. We should definitely.
I know you are, which is why I appreciate hanging out with you.
Let him know. Let him know. I'm a nice guy.
I tell no one anything ever.
Oh my goodness. All right, so here's the thing. I feel like we can get started, but I know there's going to be some amazing and beautiful things and moments, and I just don't want folks to miss out. But in the interest of time, Amanda, what do you think? We roll?
Yeah, I think so.
Fantastic. So good evening, everyone. Thank you guys for joining us in this important conversation. I see a lot of familiar faces, even former students, which is great. I'm excited to be joined by my good friend Chris Newell, who I'm very appreciative of, because he's always kind of listened, so to speak, to some of my ideas on how to offer students a more representative history in the class. And it's most times been a provocative idea that I brought to him, and he's never turned those things down, which I always appreciate. We have Nick Bear, the poet, the artist, and he's too, I think, an incredible person given the circumstances in which we met. He delivered a powerful poem at the Wabanaki open mic, community open mic, and I met him through that event. I reached out to him and I told him just how much of a fan I was of the message and the conviction in his voice and all that good stuff. And he joined and decided to also come and share his art with us. And of course, I'm joined with Amanda Dalricio and Chrissy Pondit, who are also helpers not only to Fairfield Yabantu, but also to our anti-racism group, equity and diversity group at school. So welcome everybody. Without further ado, I would love to give Nick Bear the floor to kind of bless us with this conversation and set the tone, my brother.
Appreciate that, Trey. So as he said, we kind of linked up at an open mic presentation a few days ago, and I was fortunate enough to be invited to this presentation, and I'm going to do a couple pieces. The first one is called February Weather, and here it is. Wake up and smell the colonization. Assimilate to get degraded by your own people. God forbid I have an education. Does that mean we aren't equal? Wait, let me ask the Census Committee. Maybe they can shed some light on our plight or why they have the right to say who's more white. What happened to our pride? And when did it slide into the river like erosion, eating at our islands, liquor at our livers, drug prescriptions in lieu of feelings? The ones who need them can't afford to get chastised because their skin is brown in appearance. Is it interference? Should I be the whistleblower? The referee in this match doesn't have the balls to come over. That bridge, their stacked chips. Our happy kids are never in the same sentences, even if we had the best representatives. The facts are this. We are our bastard children, nourishing our mother with false sovereignty because America's idea of government is a form of genocide or robbery. My drum, my heart, my songs, my arc. If I could sing away our blues, I would with patience for warrior sun shades, red flowers for daughters' braids, and send white entitlement so far away would make an executive's yearly net pay look like minimum wage. We as a nation don't need guns for fighting. Emancipation is a kaleidoscope of nations colliding. We need to start uniting, untying the chains that are binding, unwriting the lies they are hiding. We need to start living instead of merely surviving.
Fire. My goodness. Yo, can you quickly reflect on that piece real quick, man? There were so many powerful ideas you put forth there, man.
Yeah, of course. Anything specific?
What's the inspiration, perhaps, right? I feel like you said some very, very powerful things that folks...
Well, I'll start with the title. I wrote this on Groundhog Day, and it just happened to be like one of those cold, wintry kind of days up here. I don't know if anybody's familiar with Maine and what kind of awful weather we get slapped with in the winter, but it could go from, nice and sunny and it's so beautiful out to just dumping snow on you for about 24 hours straight. It was one of those kind of really frigid days where I didn't want to do anything but stay inside under a blanket and write. And I had the opportunity to do that. I had a couple of young children at the time, and I got them to sleep or nap, and I kind of holed myself up in my room, and I went bananas on the page. And as it was coming out, it started becoming more fluent with kind of things that were going on at the time with stuff that I was seeing in my tribe and among other tribes and things that I was reading about across Indian country. And it kind of it spilled out. And I think that has been my process for a lot of my spoken pieces. It has to be right from the gut. Mm-hmm. And that's basically, that's how it happened.
That's incredible. That's incredible. So you said you had a couple pieces. Do you want to share one more and then we'll swing it over to Chris?
Sure. I can do the other one that I read the other night. It didn't have a title, the other night, but after I kind of opened the door for people to kind of send me feedback on it, one of my former teachers from the Indian Island School over here, she was one of my first big supporters and one of my first major influences with my writing career, Vicky Akins. She's actually one of my cousins too. Chris knows. I mean, but we're all family around here. But she liked one of the lines from this piece and gave me the title of "When You Gonna Listen." So, when you gonna listen? Can't be for real. No, I'm not taking y'all serious. When it's my time to rhyme, the mic is just for appearances. I could get loud without it. Malcolm said, if you wanted things done, best make some noise. And you can believe that I'm about it. Yeah, we talking Michigan. Can you blame me now, though? Everyone got a degree in whatever topic is trending on their phone, and making sure to blend their spin in something with the principle. Provocation understands less a decision, more invincible. Just because you capitalize words, I'm supposed to be impressed? I felt more logic in the back of your mom's neck. But man, order in my court. Flat lines can't be close to your capacity. And the way I refresh so rapidly, it has to be the bastard in me. Lit mixing Colt assault rifle. Hide your title. Hold a dab hit scorched battery coil. Smoother than sands covering Penobscot soil. That ground is sacred. My whole sound is get naked. Y'all in need of the one? Well, he ain't here yet, so welcome to the banquet. Make yourself a plate, kid. Don't skip the Dumasas. My lines rise, it might surprise the right auntie at the social to spank Nick. And don't mind me. My mind roam free. Think for myself. Don't need a I told you to hold deed. Suppose we stop being blind to the fact that it's old breeze. The waves won't stop, no fire gonna burn when it's our turn to dig deep. I'm so sick and tired. It's a soliloquy of getting higher, and this gotta be how the wicked conspire. Should have damn known when I listened to Richard Pryor, Don Trudell, Buffy St. Marie, and the real rock rumble Link Ray when he played it for me. I get it popping like Bazooka Joe, Geronimo, Penavi beat, chopping up the giants like the 27 hominy team. Armored to the titty meat, bow and arrow showstopper, busted dam like Jean-Claude in a band with pink-haired, mohawk bit punk rockers. It isn't a contest of who has it worse. When the ones in power start hunting, it'll be us they come looking for first. I'm no easy prey. From Zion to Katahdin, Cochise to Bin Laden. We're the lost tribes and still searching, but never forgot. Hard to maintain, like when you hear the name of someone you love, someone above, not here in this field, chief. I am the plug. Vintage is my blood. An engine is the word. War cry heard like a ball hype. Bald side, back, long top is the cut. You can't hit what you can't attempt. I'm on a long overdue list of kids that should have been dead but won't accept nothing in the hell that they raise. Strut in the sun or some shade, because whether it's bright or dark, I like the mic like a flint spark perch bark. Learn, baby, learn. When you gonna listen? It isn't just us trapped here in this flesh prison. Less ass kissing, more kicking. Get after your inhibitions and turn them into exhibitions. Why we gotta be forbidden? It's juxtaposition in this land of hypocrisy. An Indian can't be driven? Shit, I ain't even got a license. Not yet. I'm patient. What's up, Doc? Who want next?
My man.
Thank you. Thank you.
Fire.
Appreciate that a lot.
That's that conviction I was talking about, man. Thank you so much, Nick Bear, for that delivery. Now, let me tell you something. If you're not inspired by that, that's not false now. That was powerful. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
For real. Thank you for responding to that call. And so now, I'm going to turn it over to Chris. Chris, I don't want to butcher your whole title, but I'm just going to say that Chris is the director of the Abbey Museum. He is a historian. He is an educator, and he was an advisor in Dawnland. And if you want to add more to your narrative, so to speak, please feel free to do so. But without further ado, everyone, welcome Chris Newell.
Hi, everybody, and Chikoha, Nick. Good job there, buddy. I mean, that was amazing, and it reminds me of my younger days. One of my biggest influences was Rita Joe. I remember her back when she was alive. I met her back in the '90s, and just how much she encouraged the younger generation to pick up a pen and write. And do things like you're doing right now. And I'm sure she's smiling down, seeing our Wabanaki folks and the strong spoken word that you exemplify here. It was really awesome.
We wouldn't need it.
So, myself, anyway, yes, my name's Chris Newell. I have a couple of roles. I am the Director of Education co-founder for a group called Egamau Educational Initiative, which is based out of Connecticut, actually, and that's where Trey and I first met. Actually, I was working for the Pequot Museum at the time, but also doing the work of Egamau Educational Initiative. And what we do basically is we work with all areas of education, K through 12 schools, colleges, universities, museums, which is our kind of our kitchen, to incorporate Native perspectives in all that they do. If they're teaching history, then the history of this country, the last couple of hundred years, you got to make sure that you do it with with the Native people involved, because Native people have been there through the entire thing. And so a lot of what Egamont does is kind of make our way into these spaces, and we help organizations that want to incorporate Native content or Native histories and do it in a culturally competent fashion, which is, some of the, the challenge as well. And I am also, as Trey mentioned, the executive director and senior partner to Wabanaki Nations for the Abbey Museum in Bar Harbor, Maine. So that's a newer title I got here in March. I am Passamaquoddy from Madocmigo, which is Indian Township, and that's in eastern Maine. And the Abbey Museum is in Bar Harbor, Maine, which is Wabanaki homeland. So I get to come home now and do exactly what I love, which is promote our histories, find ways to incorporate them into all areas of education throughout the state and the region. But I still have a lot of love for Connecticut. My children are Mashantucket Pequot, and that community there means a lot to me, and I want to make sure that their histories are told as well. Dawnland is a project that I worked on basically because that's where my heart was. This is a film that delves into very, very hard subject matter, and it's very real. It's so hard and real, the subject matter, that the people that were involved, that you see giving testimonies in the film, their stories, a lot of them, they felt they were so unbelievable that they would not even tell them even within the community. And that's really how I ended up getting involved. I was not involved during the filming. The Upstander Project came to our communities and started working with our communities prior to my meeting them. I began my work in the post-production process, and that's where the title Senior Advisor came from, because I was kind of like a utility infielder. I've worked in front of the camera for films, not much behind the camera, and I did whatever I could to make sure that the storytelling in this film was reflective of the voices of the communities that were present within the state of Maine, and adding extra layers of education to the film, because the film is meant to be educational. But also, I really felt once I saw the subject matter, and I saw the first rough cut of the film, and I saw how much the filmmakers had earned the trust of people that I had grown up with, some of them being blood relatives of mine, to tell their stories to them where they wouldn't even tell them to us. That to me was a moment where I decided to jump into the filmmaking process, just to make sure to have a Wabanaki voice in there, to have it culturally competent, to make sure it's being told right. We didn't want to make a film that was just something for the general audience to understand and be proud of and learn from. We wanted something for the communities that the communities would understand and also feel proud of when it comes to the storytelling. And so that's where a lot of my involvement came in. And when it came to this particular film, like I said, these are people I grew up with. These are people that I'm surrounded by still. My communities are my home. And so I did it for no pay. I would not take a paycheck for the purpose of my help in this film. I helped raise funds. I did a lot of addition to some of the ways the maps are laid out and the music that's presented in there. I was also a big part of putting a lot of the traditional music into that film as well. But I did 3.5 years of work for no pay because I did not want to benefit financially off the pain of those people. It just did not feel right for me to do that. And I think because of the spirit that we all put into it. I mean, the Upstander Project, those are tremendous people. They teach genocide is what they do. And they've been teaching the Rwandan genocide here in the U.S. And they felt that it was just not right that they continue to teach genocide without talking about indigenous genocide. And that's why they decided to document the Truth and Reconciliation Commission happening in the state of Maine at the time. And they are tremendous people, as I said. They're non-native filmmakers. Even at the beginning, I've been approached by non-native filmmakers to be involved in projects before, and I've always kind of shied away from it because the lack of control, that happens, with those types of projects, and when you give your advice. But in this particular instance, it was completely the opposite. What I found out about them, Adam, Mishi, Ben, when they were filming, they were doing things like turning off the camera when they were asked to, and that's a difficult thing for a documentary filmmaker to do. And especially for the people that are editing the film, they get frustrated as heck with that. But as you saw with the film, there's a lot of moments in there where it really just needed to happen, and they were willing to do that. So they, because of the spirit, I think, that we all put into it, I think that's why it's risen to the level that it has. Getting picked up by PBS, showing that year in 2018 to 2.2 million viewers. It was the most viewed episode of Independent Lens that season by double. Then the Emmy Award that came along later that year was just an amazing experience. I got to be on stage with Esther Ann and with Denise, Dee Dee, who was somebody that I have a childhood relationship with. I've known her my entire life. And just to be there for that moment for them was really awesome. So, that's a little bit of my background, how I got into this project, who I am. Just wanted to lay all that down before we start opening it up for questions.
Fantastic. Thank you, Chris. And so, folks, I'm going to bring forth some questions for Chris, and I know that Amanda has some as well, for the sake of a dialogue. And then after that, we're also going to open it up for everyone really to have questions for Chris and about the movie. But again, it's supposed to be a conversation, so we're gonna roll it with it that way. And Chris, you brought up this point of like the creating the movie and the importance of that movie and having to tell the story correctly. And my first question had always been, and some of my students watched parts of it, what was the intended purpose of Dawnland as a movie?
Yeah, so the intended purpose was to document the Wabanaki Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which is the very first government-sanctioned. Oh, and by the way, thank you, Faith, for mentioning thanks to the animals in the comments there. That's my cousin Alan Sakabasin's book. He wrote that. So that's a pleasant thank you for that. But yeah, the purpose of the film was to document the Wabanaki Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which is the first government-sanctioned Truth and Reconciliation Commission about the foster care system, and it was to cover the years from 1978 to 2012. So this is post Indian Child Welfare Act, which was enacted in 1978. And you see the hearings at the beginning of the film. That was actually what won the Emmy. Was we cover that footage that was never before seen footage of the actual hearings that led up to the creation of the Indian Child Welfare Act. So the government taking our children, this is something that's been happening going back to the days of residential schools, even before that, but it became, codified as part of U.S. policy with the creation of residential schools in the late 19th century. As those began to fade, it was taken up by projects such as the Indian Adoption Project, which you see kind of mentioned in the film. That was literally a project where they took 200 Indian kids and purposefully adopted them to white families, and to make them better, supposedly to make their lives better. That was the idea, and that was in the 1950s. Now that's a very real story, a very real part of history. And then eventually that bled into the child welfare system, and adoption and foster care became some of the things that we ended up having to fight against. Even though they have a stated purpose of helping a child, what was happening was an extremely high taking of Native children, especially in the state of Maine. And at one time, if you were a Native child in the state of Maine, you were 19 times more likely to end up in the foster care system than a non-Native child. That's a ridiculous number. Even today, you're still about 3 to 5 times more likely, even even with all the work that we've done. But imagine that. I grew up with my parents. I never got removed, and none of my siblings got removed. And I consider us lucky because of it, because of those percentages. That's not true for all of my blood family. That's not true for all of the people in my community, not my childhood friends. And I know of families that literally move their children back and forth across the border at times to protect them from the child welfare system, because they were actively after them. So this was to document what the state of Maine was doing post the federal law, the Indian Child Welfare Act, which was meant to keep Native families together. And the high taking of Native children by the state of Maine, and it needed to be documented because not every story is one of abuse, but the truth is many of these children experience all levels of different types of abuse, and they take that story with them. They brought it back home with them, and that intergenerational trauma creeps into when they raise their children, and it becomes a cycle that gets perpetuated over and over and over. And so the trauma that was being felt by sometimes even just a removal, being taken hundreds of miles away from home and having no idea where the heck in the state you even are geographically and how you would even get back home if you wanted to. Just that alone is mental torture. And that was a common thing. And it was oftentimes the state of Maine doing things, through the lens of, the colonized lens. For Passamaquoddy people, we are considered migrant people, and that even under colonization, even with reservations, that's still true. When I was a child growing up, in fact, the migrant program, which is a federally funded program for children that are children of migrant workers, was actually part of our school system because it was common for parents to work seasonally, moving around the state, picking potatoes in October, blueberries in August, tipping in the winter, hunting, fishing, so they were removed from the reservation at times. They did move around a lot. Not all the times they could take their children, but within our cultural context, the entire community raises our children. In our community, every adult, everyone my age has the right to call every child dus or gwuz. Duz or Gus as affection names for daughter or son. So what that shows is that we all have a collective responsibility to raise our children, and the family raises the child, and the community raises the child. So when the parents would leave, they would be left with sister, brother, grandma, grandpa, I should say, and to the state though that was neglect. Legally that's neglect because they're leaving their children for extended periods of time. Meanwhile, the needs of the child are being taken care of. Food, shelter, and love and all of those are and not to mention culture. The grounding of who they are being given all through that process, and they are not on want of anything. But yet the state would look at those situations and say they are violating our law, therefore we take their children. And this was a common process and something that we have been trying to undo ever since. So it's really what it is. It's a continuation of genocide. They call it cultural genocide within the film. But it really, qualifies under just that word genocide. Genocide is more than just mass killing of an entire group of people. It's trying to destroy a culture in whole or in part is genocide, and also removing the population of children from one population to another is also genocide. So these are both under the UN definition, things that were happening that are genocidal tactics, and something that, needed to be brought forth and needed to be told. So that's where the TRC came about. And Dawnland, thankfully, with the blessing of the communities, became, kind of the megaphone for getting this story out there.
That's right. That's right. Nick, I noticed you were shaking your head. Obviously, you could attest to some of these things that Chris just talked about, right?
Absolutely. Very much so. I'm very appreciative that Chris was able to do this film and to really give his time and energy with everybody else from his community and our communities up here. The film itself is incredible, and I'm glad that an event like this is formed, because even though it did hit 2.whatever million. Whatever that number was, it can always get more.
Right.
And that's really really what I would like to see for this film and for stuff like this.
For sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Chris, thanks for being with us, and Nick Bear, thanks. It's good to meet you. Thanks for coming to talk about this, which I know is a very painful and ongoing and difficult issue to talk about in the community. I was glad that Trey started with the question of what was the purpose of the film. I was also reflecting on a similar question, especially in light of what I thought was an interesting discussion in the movie about even the phrase truth and reconciliation. And at one point, someone says, it seems like the white people really want to skip over the truth and get right to the reconciliation. And that seems fair. And that she said at one point, this really should have just been called a truth commission, because that is what we're doing. We're sort of telling the truth and we're working on healing. And this sort of beautiful but difficult idea to grapple with not knowing what reconciliation is going to look like, and being okay with that, just sort of sitting with the truth and then saying, okay, we believe reconciliation might be possible, but we don't know what it looks like. Mm-hmm. And so I actually saw the movie as being sort of in that spectrum. It's a truth movie, but I also thought that perhaps within it there are the seeds of what reconciliation might look like. But I guess it begs the question of what has happened since they stopped filming. So what has happened since then? Has there been more discussions, more sort of talking circles, action, anything like that?
So that's a great question. I mean, we made the film as an educational tool. So it actually has a teacher's guide, by the way. So if you guys want it shown in your school with, a great teacher's guide written by Dr. Michie Lesser, who's part of the Upstander Project, it's free and downloadable from dawnland.org. So it's definitely there. And yeah, you see in the film that arc of understanding. It happens not just with the people in in the with Esther Ann in Reach. It doesn't happen with just the people that are giving statements, but it also happens with the commissioners, in that they have an arc of understanding of what the better goal is in this work. And that became a tough question. What does reconciliation actually look like? So people had to, kind of wrestle with that quite a bit. And what they ended up discovering through the process is that, as I mentioned in the beginning, some of these stories, and you don't see the worst of it in the film. We purposely didn't put the worst of it because we didn't want to make it into trauma porn. You know what I'm saying? We didn't want it to be something like that. We wanted people to understand the actual, the cycle that's going on here. But some of those stories, let me tell you, are so hard to hear that you can understand why they thought that nobody would ever believe them. Dee Dee is one that in her testimony, they turned the camera off, as she was talking. She describes much more abuse. They would do things to her and her sisters, like her sister would get in trouble for maybe stealing a banana. And they would find the banana peel. And so what they would do is they would make her kneel on a broom in a doorway and force her sisters as they walked by to yank and pull her hair. This was what the foster parents were requiring of her and her sisters, to abuse their own sibling in this process, So when it comes to that, then the process of healing is really beginning when people start to actually believe, and for Dee Dee was one of the Denise Altvater, who was in the film. She really is one of the ones that opened the door for this to happen. She's the one that first started to speak about it publicly, about what happened to her and her sisters. And the most powerful thing that she remembers recalling is that feeling that she could tell her story and that this Truth and Reconciliation Commission would actually believe her. And that's the most important part that she was focused on. So when it comes to reconciliation, everybody's at a different place in the healing process here. And the process begins by the telling of truth and by the believing of truth. And that's what we ended up learning, everybody, I think, throughout the film. That's where it goes. And so since the film has been made, I have seen different people react to it in different ways. Some people are, only told their story in the film. But it had a remarkable effect on them, but some folks have taken it to another level. And one that I bring up is Dawn Neptune Adams, who comes from Indian Island. She's one of the ones in the film. She was a very quiet person, before this film got released. She didn't even want necessarily her footage to be in the film, and telling her story in the film was a very hard thing for her to do. She ran for president this last time around. She has gotten so good at telling her story and advocating for her people and for others that have gone through the same thing that she went through, that she has become an excellent public speaker and an excellent advocate for people, for humanity. So she actually ran on the Green Party ticket for the state of Maine for president, for vice president, I should say. She was on the ticket as presidential candidate. So think of that. Imagine coming from just a few years ago, being in a shell, scared to come out of it and even tell your truth, to the point where now she's exploding it and telling it to the world and saying, this was wrong. It can't happen again. And so there's some amazing thing that happens with some people, and it happens at different paces for everybody. Dawn is an amazing, example of what the potential can be. But for everybody else, everybody moves at their own pace. And so reconciliation, that might not happen until generations from now. That's what we ended up realizing. So is that the goal of what we're doing right now? Probably not. Maybe some people do get to that point. That would be great if they did. But it's really about stopping this cycle so that we don't keep perpetuating it to our children and this keep this cycle of intergenerational trauma going on. So that's where the truth really lies, is as we continue to tell the story and it continues to be believed, then the power of healing seems to be coming back into our communities. But what I tell people about this is that this is only one state. When there's 50 more states or 51 more states to go here, and the story is the same literally as you go across the country. So when it comes to telling the story for Native peoples, we're at the point, and the picture I always draw is like when you buy a brand new textbook, hardcover textbook, and you open it the very first time and you hear that creaking sound. That's where we're at when it comes to telling this story. And so we really have a lot more work to be done when it comes to getting this across to the rest of the country to start this process of truth telling so that we can begin the process of healing. Does reconciliation happen this generation? Probably not. Maybe it will for some people, maybe it won't, but that is not the intended goal for what we learned through this process here. It's really about getting to that point of, starting to heal rather than being self-destructive. And that's where it really lies. So there's been efforts. REACH, of course, is still very active within the state of Maine, and of course is bringing the story out. They have done things like taken the Kairos blanket exercise and they've adapted it to Wabanaki people's history only. Very powerful experiential learning exercise that'll actually, you'll experience the entirety of colonization from the perspective of Indigenous peoples within less than an hour. And it brings people to tears, engaging in that particular exercise. So that's where we're at now, is we have more and more people believing us when we tell our truths. And because of that, the presence of Native peoples in the state of Maine is growing to the point where we can't be left out of the conversation a lot of the times anymore.
That's fantastic. Hey, real quick, Chris, thank you for that. I just want to tell the people here, I know that there's some educators on this call, that as Chris talks about truth telling and sharing stories and ensuring that it's an accurate story and a more representative story, I have to say that, like, Nick, drop your email on this, because talk about narratives and people's voices, so to speak, being in the classroom. If you're an educator, or if you have a platform in which you speak about history or social issues, Chris's voice and conviction, so to speak, in his truth and telling his story is obviously important. So if you want to hit him up, he will drop his email on this. Chrissy?
Thank you so much, Chris and Nick Bear, for joining us tonight. I have a question. You mentioned earlier about cultural context and how a lot of the white social workers that were coming in were kind of seeing these norms within your community and we're saying, well, this isn't how this should be. And we're removing children out of completely appropriate situations. When I watched the film, it struck me that there was a moment when the commission was getting really frustrated because they weren't, or there was other people that weren't allowed into these talking circles. And it kind of reminded me of that same trying to enforce these cultural norms onto a community, even when they're trying to do the right thing. Can you speak a little bit about that dynamic, that kind of push and pull between two different kind of cultural contexts, and what's the best way maybe moving forward for communities to be able to have a more positive outcome that doesn't have that stress of one community trying to impose their norms onto the other?
Yeah, that's a great question. That particular scene that you're talking about, that's really, a struggle with white privilege. That's the easiest way to describe it. The idea that as a non-Native person, you have a right to whatever we have as intellectual property, and that includes our pain. And that's really what was going on there, is that there was a lot of people with the right intention that really wanted to have something cementable that they could call upon that they said was good out of this process. And you see Esther Ann, kind of putting them in their place, saying that, wait a minute, hold on here. You don't get to define that. We get to define what that is. And we're not ready to make that definition yet. And she's she's a bear of a person, Esther. I mean, she's the perfect one, to do that work when it came to that particular moment. Because she's really speaking to what generations, my father's generation is the one that can speak to that as well, of not being listened to, for having, non-natives come into our spaces and interpret what they see rather than just listening. That is a common thing. I mean, anthropology has been one of the most extractive sciences to date, until very recently. And it used to be a joke in Lakota communities that every family was assigned a white anthropologist and they all lived in a tent in front of their house. And that's basically how it was in the 60s and the 70s. It was not unlike that. In our communities in Maine, it's not much different there either. A whole lot of interpretation, a lot less listening. So that's where Esther was really speaking to that generations of that constant, museums taking our funerary objects and putting them on display, like all of that frustration of, the way our cultures get interpreted in colonized spaces, by colonized people, under their lens, rather than allowing us to speak for ourselves. Like literally, that's a lifetime of frustration of her experiences from childhood in school, learning first Thanksgiving narratives and all the other stuff that we have to experience, and it's just kind of boiling up there in that moment, saying, hey, wait a minute here, we've been trying it your way for the last 250 years or so. Let's stop for a minute, let's try it our way, and let's see what comes out of that. And that's really, I think, what you see going on in that moment. That's the feeling that I have, definitely, is I can feel Esther's frustration, because it's something that we kind of all experience, going through, walking through this world. I always tell people that it took me 18 years to figure out how to grow up to be a good Passamaquoddy man. It took me another 18 years to figure out how to live as an American. I didn't understand what that was when I left the reservation and how different that was, and how frustratingly invisible Native people are in America. So I definitely felt where she was coming from, that when it comes to our culture is 12,000 plus years old on this landscape. We have the original owner's manual, and we're now speaking under the disruption of colonization and using the English language. We need to undo that. And so, it requires listening on the part of the people that are outside of that community. It requires, to tell you the truth, it would really require those people to learn our language and learn our worldview that way, because we're speaking in the English language, which means we're speaking in the worldview of England, where you can own land as property. We can't do that in my language. Land or soil is the molecules of our ancestors. We can't own that. It's a part of a cycle of life that will, give everything that we need if we work to sustain it. Whereas in England, people own land and they commodified it by farming it or raising, cows, chickens, or pigs and selling, and that's how they lived. And they were better suited to buy their food than they were to produce their food sustainably. From what in the English language is wilderness. So even there, the fact that we're speaking in English, the word wilderness is a very benign term these days, but it was actually a term of erasure back in the times of discovery. If you could declare a land wilderness in the English language, that means people don't live there. It is not civilization. Therefore, it can be discovered under the doctrine of discovery. And that is literally how this country still claims land. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, as much as, we love her for all the great work that she did, was not very good when it came to Native rights, and actually, cited the doctrine of discovery in land cases that had to do against tribes when it came to the United States government's right to own land in this country. She literally cited the Doctrine of Discovery from 1493 as the legal justification for Americans owning land. So we still live under that, and getting through and pushing through all of that is a frustrating process at times, and it does require every once in a while that people sit down and listen. Maybe we're talking in English now, but you really, you need to understand how we get along to each other. What does healing look like for us? It doesn't look the same culturally as it does, outside of our world.
That's right. Yo, Chris, I'm going to ask you one more question, and then I would love to open it up for folks to ask questions as well, because, it's a conversation. So here's my question. I'm curious to know if you can speak on this a bit more. It says to save the human and kill the Indian. Can you explain the concept more? And then, I feel like I have a general gist of what it is, but I'd love for you to explain that more. And then, why were folks, do you think, reluctant to call it cultural genocide, right? Throughout the movie, there was a reluctance to call it cultural genocide even. I'd love to know why you think that is.
Yeah, so the first part of your question, that saying from Colonel Henry Pratt, kill the Indian to save the man. I mean, that's literally what the basis of the residential school system was built upon. The first one being Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And my grandfather was taken away. My grandfather died an alcoholic as a result of his experience at Carlisle, the trauma that he experienced there. So these schools weren't, they were meant as a forced acculturation, literally to take us as children out of our cultural context where we were learning how to use the land as a way of sustaining life, subsistence living, all of those types of things, take you out of that context completely, put you inside a brick building and force you to learn the things that Euro-Americans wanted you to learn, which would have been, women would have been sewing clothes. For men, it was construction, and backbreaking labor, that type of stuff. That's what they were teaching them, is how to get a job, earn money, and fit into this, once again, this European model of life, where you work for a wage, something is currency, and that currency is then traded for the goods that you need, rather than you living inside of an entire environment, a climate, an environment that will provide everything you need for it if you properly do the work to sustain the land. The fact, the idea that Native people lived in wilderness is actually completely false. It was, the forest, even when Verrazano came through, way before the Mayflower in 1524, he went as far as 15 leagues inland on the eastern coast, and he would describe the forest as being these perfectly manicured areas that were well taken care of they were cultivated, and they were growing fruits and food everywhere. I mean, it was obvious that, the people were taking care of these landscapes to grow all that they needed out of it. And, so that idea that Native people were not using the landscape properly according to European standards is totally false. So there's the idea really was a cultural genocide to eliminate the 1,000 plus different Native cultures. Even these terms that we use, Native American, American Indian, that's all once again a European idea of singularizing us under one umbrella term. Nix Penobscot, I'm Passamaquoddy, that we're not the same. We're quite related because we're all Wabanakis and we have a common cosmology there, but he speaks a different language than I do. And culturally, we're slightly different from one another. And, that's the way Native cultures are all across the country. We get way different from one another as you expand out more geographically. And so the idea of singularizing us under terms like Native American, American Indian, Native, Indigenous, I mean, even there's a fault in learning that, and that's colonized thinking when we have to do that, but we are speaking in a colonized language, the English language. Occasionally we have to use those things. So that's what was happening, is they were attempting through these school systems to eliminate the cultural memory of the ancestors that were being taught within the cultural context, just trying to eliminate that completely and replace it with this Euro-American idea of what they were calling civilization. And that's where the whole genesis of kill the Indian to save the man. In other words, they were being good Christians in that they were not actually killing the Indian anymore, which, the Plains Wars had ended. There's a long history of that. So they got past to that point and then went to the next section of genocide, which is trying to destroy the culture either in whole or in part, and removing entire generations of people, of children from their communities and raising them that way. And, this is something that, the last residential schools didn't close till the 90s. This is not ancient history. We have parents that went through this school system. So this is something that we still live with within our communities today. And I forgot the second part of your question, Trey, sorry.
No, it's all good. But listen, you just said something really good, and then I'm going to let the other people talk. I got to ask, are you distrustful, though, keep it real with me, institutions like schools and churches, given that those are the same institutions used to colonize, so to speak, you know what I mean? Have you ever been distrustful or real critical, so to speak, of places like schools and churches? I, for one, I'm going to keep it 100. I'm certainly skeptical of those institutions, right? Because I know that they were used, right, I'm Congolese, so they were used in the process of colonization in my country, but as well as subjugation of African Americans. Are you skeptical in that way too of those institutions?
Definitely. I'm not going to lie. I grew up in a Catholic church. We have what was a Catholic Indian mission. It is now a parish. I was even an altar boy in church. The Catholic Church has been ingrained with our culture since the 1700s, and we actually have religious syncretism going on there. So the Catholic Church that I grew up in was a Passamaquoddy church. It's very much different. The liturgy is the same in a lot of ways, but we use our language in the liturgy, and so it actually gets translated culturally. And what I always tell people about it is that when it comes to that, even though we have people that are devout Catholics, our cultures, our ancestors indigenized the Catholic religion a long time ago, and the Catholics just never figured it out. And I'll give you an example how that happened. Both churches, we have two communities, Zubaik and Madakmagok, and the church on each community is called St. Anne's. Now, culturally, women arise, especially elder women arise to the highest social stature within the community, the clan mothers. Grandmothers especially are considered, it's kind of like super special and are given the most respect. And both churches are named St. Anne, which is the mother of Mary, in other words, the grandmother of Jesus. And so what they were doing is they were taking the Catholic religion and they were interpreting it under Passamaquoddy worldview, and then reinserting themselves back into it, with the missionaries. And there's a lot of reasons why they were escaping disease. They felt that this might have been the only way to survive. But once again, they did indigenize the religion. And so the church that I grew up in is not necessarily it falls under the diocese of the greater, Roman Catholic Church, but it's very much different. It's very culturally different. I was never really too worried about the system as a whole, because I didn't see it outside of that context of how the Catholic Church operates in a larger context. But once I got out of my community, I began to see how much, sometimes religious organizations, especially when it comes to adoption, still push, and even in 2020, the narrative that we have to be saved, that we have to accept some form of Christianity, then we have to be saved from ourselves. That still exists even in this time. When you hear stories, about the fights against the Indian Child Welfare Act, like the baby Lexi story, that was once again a set of religious parents that were fostering a Native child. And once they got a Native child, they said, their church told them, you need to adopt this child because this child needs to be saved because they're Native. And that's where that whole fight started from. So, it still goes on to this day. I mean, the practices that were blatant in the 50s and 60s are still present in 2020. And a lot of them are present within the structures of, these organizations.
Right. Hey, folks, I could talk to Chris all day, but I want to give you all a chance to also ask him some questions. So please, by all means, get in there and share your thoughts and questions.
I
I
did.
have a question. Oh, sorry.
Oh, someone going? Sorry.
Go ahead, please.
Oh, I wanted to comment on what Chris was just talking about with when they said the church if you were going to adopt a Native American children, you had to like you said protect them. How do you think they felt, the kids, when it was kind of like a standard before, like at the church, like it's someone else telling you you have to do something to protect them? How do you think they felt?
Well, I mean, what do you do as a child? It's tough. The people that you depend upon for survival are telling you that you have to follow this way, or something bad is going to happen to you. So, do you choose to believe that, or do you choose not to? For everybody, I think went through different levels of how much they chose to believe. For me, as I said, I grew up in the Catholic Church with nuns as teachers and things like that. I had a good experience with the Catholic Church, but that doesn't mean that everybody else in my community did. And that really, a lot of that was happening outside of the community with other places. So, to be told that as a child, that just because of who you are, you need to be, just because of how you were born and who your parents are, that you need to be saved from that. I mean, imagine what, as a child, having to process that information and what kind of damage is being done internally to the personhood of those individuals. And I'll give you a great example. My eldest sister was adopted out pre-Indian Child Welfare Act, and my father never knew about her existence until she was 24 years old, and she found us when I was 16 years old. That was the very first time I met her. She was once again, raised initially by parents that were telling her that, they needed to save her from the fact, and even her biological grandfather, wanted her adopted out because the fact that she was half Indian, for this whole idea, so she was adopted twice. And then the second adoption, she ended up growing up with very loving parents. But even under that context, she knew she was Passamaquoddy. She knew she had a Passamaquoddy dad, yet all that information was kept from her, and it caused damage. It caused tons of damage to the person that she became as an adult. And it took her a long time to heal from that. It took her a good 20 years or so of reconnecting with our community to be able to undo just having that absence of the reality of who you are present within your childhood. So just imagine going through that process. I always say for me, I was lucky that I didn't have to experience that. Dawnland is not my story, but for those that did, it's such a tough road to travel down to have to recall these memories, but it is part of the process of healing. So, I focus on it a lot, and I think that's probably what drives me to continue to keep talking as much as possible about this subject.
I have a question for you, Chris.
Mm-hmm.
As an educator and a historian, well, you said it earlier that healing and reconciliation starts with the speaking of truth. What is a message that we could send to our children today to give them hope? Because it's not going to be solved in one generation, right? This is just something that's just beginning. The genocide and the hatred is almost instantaneous. You can wipe out a people with a snap of your fingers. To come back from that and to heal is a multi-generational process. What do I tell my 8 and 5-year-old now? How do I raise them not to fucking hate white people? Like, I don't trust the Catholic Church. I wanted to be a Catholic priest for the first almost 20 years of my life. I can't believe what I once held sacred. How do I get past that, or how do I help my children get past that? because I believe we're all deserving of love, even the perpetrators of genocide. I believe that intellectually, yet I still want to gouge people's eyes out sometimes. How do I send a message? That's not the right thing to do.
Right. No, I get that energy, Anthony. I totally do. And for me, it involves really returning back to my culture. In the end, we're all Bamasa Winawuk. We're all human beings. These labels that we put on one another, that in the English language of Native American, Black, white, red, whatever we choose, the creation of races and all of that divides us. We don't have those terminologies in our language. We had to create them actually when Europeans arrived. Our first words for Europeans were actually, we used to call them hairy-faced men. And then later on, the term in Passamaquoddy became Wenuch, and that's what we use these days and translate as a white man. We're talking about really Europeans. But the etymology of that word is really Wenuch, means, who are you? Where do you come from? So it's really a question. Our word for a white person is really, a question. Who are you? So it's a different context when you think of it culturally that way, that these labels that the English language puts on us as human beings are simply not the natural way that we should act. And so I return back to my culture, that 12,000 years of history in our language, and remember that we do not have linguistical terms, in our language, to separate one another this way. We call ourselves, by where we live. Passamaquoddy is the anglicized version of Beskidamugadi, which means the people who spear pollock, which refers to the where we live in the mouth of the St. Croix River, which is Skudig. So we're named after our lifeways and how we live, but we're all human beings. Therefore, intermarriage would happen easily between Passamaquoddies and Penobscots, because it's just two human beings coming together. We don't have those labels separating us. And that's the one thing that I would focus on is our humanity together, because regardless, hard histories are hard histories. We have to learn them. We do. And we can't sanitize them, and there's something that happens to us when we do learn them. But we have to learn them because we have to learn the lessons of that history so that we as human beings, as Bamauso Winawuk, can do better going forward. Because regardless of what happened in history, we're all here now. And we all have to think about the world we leave for the children that we have going forward. And that's where my focus, always constantly remains. And I tell people that when it comes to doing this work of trying to heal intergenerational trauma, I will probably not live to see the end of, the end goal of my work. But that does not mean I don't do the work, because I have children and they're going to have children. And I want them to grow up in a world where they are no longer invisibilized. The actual history of their genocide of their ancestors is part of the conversation that the world talks about, so that we can talk about how to do better going forward, because we got to live sustainably in this country here. We're not doing it. And guess what? Native people did for 12,000 plus years, and we can help get ourselves together, all of us together, to live sustainably back on this land again, if we do it right.
Thank you.
Yo, Chris, that was my man. Yes, I mean, obviously, yes. That is, hey man, thank you for that. That's optimism. That's like the positive kind of attitude that we need to have. Dude, that's what keeps you going, obviously, right? And that's important for us, and for me certainly to remember as well. Which kind of, I'm sorry, I'm gonna steal this real quick. Lori is on, and she's a good friend. I'm sorry, I'm gonna call you out. I'm curious to know, with Chris's words right now, it kind of lends itself to like an optimism, obviously, that we ought to have continuing on, right? And all of that stuff. And I'm going to then turn my attention to you and kind of ask, because you work in an institution, and I do believe that institutions play roles of ensuring that erasure is addressed. Our children see themselves. So, when John shakes his head, yes, it means I'm doing something right. And so, I'm going to ask, that so in order for us to to actualize what Chris just described about kids seeing themselves and all of that stuff, how do you think then institutions like yours, the one you work in, and John, you can chime in after that too. How do we ensure that we are doing right by the children and ensuring that they are seen in the narrative of our lived experience, our community, and all of that stuff? Laura, you got it.
You put me on the spot.
No.
Thank you. Thank you for doing that. And many thanks to Chris and Nick and Trey and Yabantu and Amanda for pulling this all together tonight. I think, just as what you saw in Dawnland and just what Chris is speaking about and Trey is speaking about, it comes with listening. It comes with understanding intentions and knowing when to listen and knowing when to speak. But also it's an understanding and awareness of where we can't see, and what has been pushed from generations before us onto us now, and saying, well, okay, this is where we are. What's wrong with that? What have we been taught in the past that maybe from people who weren't listening before? I'm a practicing yogi, and one of the things that always comes up in understanding yoga and understanding your awareness is that the knowledge that's been passed down to you comes from your teachers. And when you work within an institution, often it isn't a collective of teachers knowledge. It's a small collective of a small group of individuals who said, we're going to establish something in order to pass on our story. Not necessarily an inclusive story of a geographic region or whatever it may be, but understanding where your beginnings came from and where you are today and where those blockages are, or where doors aren't open for you. And so I think it's just really, moving forward together. And I have a mentor who says to me, we all breathe together, just in memory and remembrance of that. Of how we can be more inclusive starts with how we're not being inclusive and listening to how we can be better. I don't know if that answers your questions, but it really does help for me to kind of, okay, like, I'm just going to stop talking now and I'm going to listen.
No, I understand that. Thank you. John, thoughts?
Oh, I got thoughts, Trey. Okay. So, first of all, thank you to everybody on here. Dawnland ruined me. And I consider myself a rather, informed human being, but like, this is a part of history by design, I think, that I was never really, informed about. And so as I'm sitting there, I'm texting Trey, I'm like, dude, this is destroying me. I'm weeping tears of rage as I go through this. But Chris, you bring up some really interesting points. The first one I want to mention is the fact that, the U.S. government, in probably sort of like the Western way in which we view the world, is that collective responsibility equals neglect. And I think that is a really important way for us to view why and how we are in the sort of catastrophic crisis that we are in right now in 2020. When the individual is the be-all, end-all, and the community is sort of, at best, secondary, if not like almost detrimental to the cause, that's when climate change or climate crisis happens. That's when political crisis happens. That's when economic crisis happens. So I just think that's such an interesting point, that this idea of like, if the village raises the child, then it's wrong and neglectful, even though that seems to the way that we should be kind of viewing our current situation right now, as a nation and as a global community. So that's the first point. Feel free. I'm going to go a little all over the place here. The second thing, though, that I always bring up with Trey is that I think the only mechanism that we have in order to truly enact the changes that we need to make, because it's not going to happen economically, it's not going to happen politically, it's not going to happen religiously in any real tangible way that I can surmise. But if we can insert these sort of ideals into the educational system, that's where we can start changing the minds of the generations to come in order to make this generational change that we're talking about. So it's just funny that we keep talking about everything in the past tense. Like almost every single thing that we've talked about is like how these things used to happen. And in a very real, palpable, tangible, visceral, bodily harm way, it was something that was happening in the past. I mean, even the recent past, the past nonetheless. So I just think that this new form of standards and assimilation that's happening all day, every day in our educational institutions is a more subversive and invasive way in which we've colonized the world. So like I'm wearing a shirt right now that says decolonize education. And the point, I don't even know if I have a question, but I think where I'm going with this is that we all the time, we get told about like kids need standards in school and kids need these sort of like every kid needs to blank before they leave and every kid needs to blank before they leave. But my question always comes back to the more I learn about history and the more I learn about like the colonized way in which we view the world is that like, why is it and who says that every kid has to blank before we go somewhere? So I guess maybe my question here is this. Chris and anyone else on the call, like how can we ensure that we change the educational system to make this, to sort of decolonize it, to take away this sort of like white classical centric norms as the be all end all of anything and everything that is happening in our classrooms? How can we flip that on its head in a very real way in order to get the kids that are coming to understand that this isn't the way that the world has to work? That's my question, I guess.
Yeah, not a light question. I'll give a great example in coming into Trey's class. When I come in there, and I would do this for the Pequot Museum or anybody. I teach in a circle, and I would do this all the time with the kids. And there's a reason for that. The school system that we have set up is, set up basically with kind of a master and a submissive type of dichotomy going on, with an expert at the beginning, at the front of the room, standing up, head above everybody else, all the children facing forward. They're not facing each other. They don't get to socialize, because there's nonverbal socialization too. So they do things that are wrong, right? They talk and whisper, they pass notes, and they don't pay attention. And that's what my business partner Adonis calls the academy model. So that's one of the things that I constantly go against is that particular model of teaching. Yes, we have to have an adult, in way school is, there's an adult in there, but it doesn't mean that we have to teach that way. And so as much as possible, I try to incorporate circle teaching. And when I would go into Trey's class, that's the way I would do things is I would have all the students sit in a circle and I was sitting there with them so that I was part of their group. And what that does is it puts my head down at their level. Therefore, I'm not above them and they don't feel like I'm like hovering over the top like this force. I feel like I'm part. I feel like I'm part of them. They feel like I'm part of the group as well. And all of us get to see each other's eyes, right? That's that nonverbal socialization that we're doing right there, and learning behavior and how to get along with one another and what strikes us. That all of that happens with nonverbal communication when we can see each other's eyes. And so that's the way I was brought up to learn. In the cultural context that I came from. And it wasn't just, another problem that we have is that we separate all the students by age group. And that's a problem with socialization as well, because within our culture, we build in things where, you learn, we talk about learning from your elders, but you begin by learning from your older siblings. So older siblings have a duty to teach the younger ones, you know, so that they won't have to constantly keep asking the older sibling how to do stuff. You know, there's a give and take that's going on there, and there's a system that's built into it that actually works better for us and makes us more independent and makes us smarter. And that's where I think we have a struggle, is that we have a system design that separates our kid by age group, that has that academy model. So as much as we can, we got to kind of subvert that academy model and bring back in these older forms of traditional methods of teaching that do those types of things that I'm talking about. That they might seem subtle, but they're actually very transformative to the children, because what happens in a circle is that, you know, the typical quiet kids aren't quiet anymore. They start talking, you know, so that when you change the dichotomy, when you change the energy in the room by doing things that way, it changes the energy for the kids. And so the ones that normally are quiet and not participating because of the academy model are feeling welcomed and, you know, end up jumping in the discussion. And it sometimes shocks teachers. I've seen it. Never didn't happen in Trey's room, because Trey students were way, you know, ahead of the game when it came to visualization. But I've seen it happen in classrooms where literally the teacher would come up and be like, "That child has never spoken in class before," and I'm like, well, you know, that's part of the problem, is the way you're doing it, you know. So so when possible, when it makes the most sense, especially with the youngest generations, you know, employ that circle model of teaching, you know, when possible.
Fair enough.
Chris, I have a quick question, and it does relate to what John just mentioned, and it does relate also back to Dawnland. I know there, number one, they mentioned, of course, the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions from South Africa to Canada, and I was lucky once in my life to hear Justice Murray Sinclair speak when he came down here to Yale, so I learned a little bit about what happened in Canada. But I thought it was really interesting in Maine of how there was the commission, but then there also was the formation of REACH. Yeah. And it was almost and I don't want to say this the wrong way, but the indigenization of the commission and how to kind of take on the work of the healing, but also in a way that is known to the community. And I was wondering and that to me kind of does, you know, it almost speaks of a halfway point, right? Meeting in the middle of how we can move forward together. And I was just thinking about how that can be employed perhaps to classrooms or in any community where you really want to open up the doors and work forward in a more inclusive space. So I just didn't know if you had any additional details that you wanted to or could share on that development of REACH and how that came to be.
So REACH, of course, predates, the TRC. They're the ones that conceived, the TRC after their experience watching what happened in Canada, and they were involved in that process as well. So, what REACH does is literally, they work, for change and healing, and a lot of that comes with sometimes teaching hard histories, and that's why I mentioned that a lot of the work that they do is educational, and they took the Kairos blanket exercise, which is already a powerful exercise if you've ever experienced it, which can be the Canadian script or the U.S. script, and they have rewritten the script for Wabanaki script, and instead of using blankets, they use a recreated map of the state of Maine, and it's all separated by rivers as it would have been traditionally. So they do things. And they are always changing. They're dynamic. Even their name has changed. The R used to mean one thing and it means something else now. I can't remember exactly what the change was, but since the film has been made, even their name, the R has changed from one thing to another as they've continued with their mission. And that's because they're continually learning. They're continually experimenting. What works in our communities? What can we bring, to the non-Native communities that gets us to that middle ground of understanding, So a lot of the work that they're focused on is, they mentioned the film and an ally building workshop. They actually kind of went away from that. It really began to be more about building common understanding. And so you use techniques of dialogue versus debate, try to come to areas of common understanding as human beings, which is a lot of what they're really focused on these days. And that's where I think you find that middle ground. You got to remember, for non-Native folks, it's sometimes introducing the fact that, number one, Native people, especially in Connecticut, it's not uncommon, when we're at the Pequot Museum for non-Native students to walk into that tribal-owned museum and ask if the Pequots were still alive, because they've been fed, even their parents would ask, because they've been fed throughout their childhood, the Pequots were completely wiped out. Even with a Pequot educator leading their tour, they would ask that question. So it's amazing the disconnect that happens. So you have to confront that, sometimes, and sometimes you have to jar them in a way, and that's what Dawnland does for a lot of people. Is that this is not ancient history. This is happening right now, and it jars you awake, especially when you see those statistics at the very end. When you see that in Minnesota, you're still 20 times more likely to end up in the foster care system in 2020. That's today, and actually got worse since the film got made. It was 20 times at the film. It's now 22 times. So some states are still working at this project, and it requires some tree shaking to the fact that genocide is still occurring within the systems that America has created. And then once that realization, that truth-telling begins to happen, then we can have a dialogue of where we can meet in the middle of how to understand each other better. And that's where we find our humanity, that part of us that really is where our common ground is. And that's what I work at the most, is really, I work in the Colonial Museum, but I do a lot of decolonization work, and I go into other museums and I like to shake their tree a little bit and say that, I'm not against going into a museum space that only showcases Native art or, things that are, from the past only, from all artists that are dead and gone, when there's living Native communities that surround that museum and tell that museum that you are doing harm by portraying Native peoples in this way, when you have living Native communities that contribute to your story. It's hard for them sometimes to understand that the museum world is finally starting to come around, the Abbey is a great part of that conversation, which is why I love where I'm at right now currently, because I get to help lead this conversation. That's where it sometimes starts, is literally sometimes you got to grab somebody and shake their tree a little bit and be like, this really happened. This is the reality. And now, once you understand the reality, then we can start working forward from there.
Fantastic. Chris, we're nearing the 2-hour mark, and I know that it's a Tuesday night. And you kind of segued into what I really want to address as well here, which is that, the purpose of Yabantu and the purpose of this movie, as I started earlier with asking you the question of what was the intended purpose of Dawnland as a documentary, I must also then kind of close out with this question of, the intended purpose for me to share this movie and to have folks watch it was in part a question, and it's an open-ended question. It's a curiosity, right? That I would like to kind of welcome you all in engaging and considering, which is that, Chris, you said that you're one to tell museums, right, that there are living Native Americans, there are artists, and there are, you help them decolonize their educational space and so on. So the question is simple, and it's this: how do we watch something like this, like Dawnland, right? And a lot of us were moved by it. How do we watch it and kind of take from it what they presented and address the issue of erasure, address the issue of whitewashing, if you will, address the issue of not limited representation, so to speak, in narratives, in educational spaces, and all of that stuff. Because I think that I'm not sure that the intended purpose of the movie was for people to just watch it and be moved, right? You're supposed to watch something and watch it and just live on, so to speak. I think you're supposed to watch it and be hype about addressing the issue it highlights, which is erasure, which is the suppression of the culture, and so on and so forth, right? Chris, what do you envision and hope for people to walk away doing and hopefully committing themselves to doing?
So in the larger frame of things, I would love that erasure that has been intentionally done by our, educational system to undo the harm that it's done. And sadly, what this often does is it causes for adults, even children that have gone through the educational system, to have a bit of an existential crisis when they find out that the first Thanksgiving narrative is actually fictional largely, and the stories of exploration are not always exploration. When it comes to ships, that's one thing, but Lewis and Clark, they were either asking directions or led by the hand everywhere they went, and just mapped what they left behind. Yet they're called explorers. So whose language is that? When we talk about history, what words are we using to describe? Let's start to challenge those a little bit. Once again, that word wilderness, where that comes from is literally, for the purpose of, considering land, to discover it. It had to be declared wilderness, which means devoid of people. And sometimes that was a forced process. The creation of national parks, before that could be conserved, right? There were living communities living on that land and stewarding that land for thousands of years. And then the U.S. Army came in and killed their food supply by killing all the bison and drove them out of there. And then the land was saved in its pristine wilderness for all of us to enjoy and be conserved for later. So starting to confront these, the basis of some of the things that we've been, kind of come to believe in as good structures. I mean, museums are themselves colonial artifacts. That's a consideration that I would hope people would start to make, and then start to see the world a little bit differently, from the educational portion of this. Museums come from with the idea of Europeans. I, as a native educator, I use museums to study, to understand why Americans believe the things they do about Native peoples in this country in 2020. Because a lot of those implicit biases are still present in the museum world. And, resetting your time clock. If you were taught that the time clock for life in this country began with the arrival of Christopher Columbus, then you need to challenge that and say, actually, what about the people that were living here since the last ice age? And what about their oral histories that tell that they were here before the last ice age, and where they were living during the ice age out in what is now the Atlantic Ocean? There's a whole lot more that we can learn about Native peoples and human beings if we get rid of the glossed over, sanitized history that we've been giving and are willing to confront it. But unfortunately, what that does is, for young people, especially if they're maybe 19, 20 years old, they have a bit of an existential crisis, because they realize that they have been taught a lot of things that are fables as truth. And that's one of the things that we need to stop doing as human beings, as adults. We need to stop telling the fables as truth, so that we stop glossing over the reality of colonization. Native people were at one time 100% of the population on this continent. We are now 2% of the population on this continent. By the year 1900, there were only 250,000 Native people altogether left within the United States. And those of us that are here today are the survivors, or the ancestors of those 250,000 that survived the genocide of the 18th and 19th centuries. That has to be real. That has to be taught as part of the story of how America got to be America. So that once again, we can start to re-envision what the future is going to look like. Because it's really that's really where I'm focused, is not not dwelling on the past. I want to teach the past to learn the lessons of history so that as human beings that we can do better going forward and get back to that point. Because ethical stewardship of this land can happen with Native and non-Native peoples living on it together. It can happen. It's just a matter of breaking down the structure that is only a couple of hundred years old. We got to remember that America is at the end of the story. This little part at the end of the story, this very long story of this land here, right? And it's a disruption that happened at the very end of it. And reframing the way we think about history and adding that 12,000 years of history and indigenous people back into the landscape in our languages and all of that. And in fact, in a perfect world, we wouldn't be speaking English anymore. You guys all would be speaking Algonquin dialects and, living in the Northeast here, and you would understand our worldview because you understand our languages. That's really the world that I would want to see someday, generations from now. It's probably not going to happen in my lifetime, but that's what I'm working towards. Is getting us to that point. English is a foreign language. Let's stop using it. Let's start using the languages that come from here and start to understand the landscape that created those languages, and start looking at the collective way that we're all responsible for this land together.
Yo, Chris, that first of all, beautiful. It can happen in your lifetime because we have folks here that work in museums. We have educators here. We have influencers of all sorts on this call, and something's going to happen in your lifetime. It has to, right? Good trouble is necessary most times. So I have faith that the people who are on this call were on this call for a reason, and that we are, especially after hearing Chris and kind of him share and be so vulnerable to share, we will not take his words in vain, and we're going to really do something about addressing the issues at hand. Folks, thank you so much for joining us in talking about Dawnland and reflecting on the history of Native Americans. Chrissy, thank you for putting this together. Lori, thank you for coming out and definitely, being open, so to speak, to hearing this dialogue. Amanda, of course, thank you for helping me organize this bit. Folks, if you want to follow Chris, again, he works for the Abbey Museum and Akumat Educational Center as well. Chrissy, can we throw that up there? And anything else from anybody before we close and say goodnight?
Thank you, guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I do have a question, since you're saying, is there anything else?
Yes, real quick. Sure.
So our American Thanksgiving is coming. I also have young children. How, Chris, would you like for this holiday, if that's how you would refer to it? We have this long weekend. Would you like to see families honor or spend the day?
Thanksgiving in and of itself, Native people celebrated Thanksgivings, and the Thanksgiving holiday that we celebrate is actually more reminiscent of the way Native people celebrated Thanksgiving in the 17th century. 17th century English Thanksgivings were days of prayer and fasting. They would not have a feast. So the idea is very different. So one of the things that I would do, and I actually wrote a nonfiction children's book that's going to be coming out next year for Scholastic, and there's a couple of Wampanoag books about the Thanksgiving holiday that are coming out. There's some truth to that story. There was a feast that happened in 1621. It did involve, people that they called pilgrims. Some of them were what they call strangers, which were the non-pilgrim English that were as part of that story as well. And they did have a feast, but it was more of a somewhat military standoff in that there was a lot of tension going on. And it was so unremarkable that the English only wrote basically one paragraph about it, three or four sentences total about the event. And it wasn't brought up again until the 19th century with Sarah Josepha Hale, and somebody pointed that out, Maureen, I think it was, pointed that out very well. Sarah Josepha Hale in the 19th century was the editor of a magazine called Godey's Ladies Book, and she's the one that promoted the popular tale of pilgrims and Indians getting together. She became a friend of William Sewell. I'm trying to make sure I got the name right. Seward, who was the Secretary of State for Abraham Lincoln. And during the tail end of the Civil War, America was, of course, divided. Because having a civil war really divided. Abraham Lincoln was looking for a way to bring the country back together. So they created this foundational mythology of pilgrims, borrowing Sarah Josepha Hale's influence from Godey's Lady's Book. And they created this tale. It was written by fiction writers. And then it began to be taught in the 1860s and 1870s in the school system as part of the foundational mythology of how the country came to be. Now, interestingly enough, because the South lost the Civil War, they skipped over the Virginia colonies, which predates Massachusetts completely, and moved the foundational myth up into Massachusetts in the North, where politically it would be accepted. So once again, we need to challenge these things, right? We know, we need to really start talking about the tale, but having a dinner to get together to, give thanks for whatever reason you do, is totally fine. I mean, if it's for the bounty of the year, if it's for your family surviving maybe a tough year, this has been a tough year on everybody. I think we should all give thanks this year for whatever we have, and remind ourselves of that. But let's not teach the fable. Let's divorce it from that. That was created for a reason, and it does not do us any good as Americans to keep believing in it.
Thank you so much, Chris, for that. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Please keep an eye out for communication from us on what more we can do to be held accountable and to hold all these institutions accountable. Yeah. Have a good night, everyone. Peace.
Thank you so much. Have a great night.